So I figured today what I would do is tell you a little bit about some work that my students and I have been doing on the evolution of intelligence and various forms of complexity that might influence that. First, I need to define intelligence for you as those processes by which organisms obtain and retain information about their environments and use that information to make behavioral decisions. This is a definition that can apply to people or monkeys or dogs or robots, whatever. But in living animals, these processes are obviously mediated by nervous systems that vary enormously in size and complexity. And nervous tissue, as you probably know, is extremely expensive. So it's rather mysterious that despite the intense costs of neural tissue, mammals have very large brains relative to their body size, and even relative to other mammals, primates tend to have very large brains and enlarged cortex and very sophisticated cognitive ability. So the question of the day is, why is this? What selection pressures might have favored the evolution of big brains and great intelligence? And because primates have such big brains, this has been mainly addressed to date by primatologists who have put forward a couple of different hypotheses. The first one suggests that big brains and great intelligence evolved to cope with complexity in the physical environment, and this might take a number of different forms. It might conceivably involve finding food, remembering where fruiting trees were and so forth, navigating through a three-dimensional environment with a great heavy body, potentially helping improve your fitness by being able to extract food from unlikely sources like these chimps in West Africa using stones to crush nuts. So there's been a fair amount of work on this, starting with Jane Goodall's observation that chimpanzees actually fish for termites using tools. And this has been supported with some work on both birds and mammals. But the alternative hypothesis, and the one that's certainly far more popular among the primatologists at the moment, is that big brains and great intelligence evolved to cope with complexity in the social environment. And the rationale here is simply that relative to those things in the physical environment I just showed you, the social environment is very labile, and being able to actually anticipate and manipulate. I knew I should have turned this off.
What's that Tuesday?
Yeah, these Simmons, stop, sorry. No, but the idea here is simply that if you can actually anticipate and perhaps even manipulate the behavior of your group mates, that could potentially have very, very big effects on your fitness. And most of the work in addressing this hypothesis to date has been done on primates, but the generality of it hadn't been addressed until recently. So my students and I thought that it might be interesting to test the generality of the social complexity hypothesis based on the following rationale: that if the big brains and great intelligence found in primates indeed were favored by social complexity, then we ought to see in non-primates who live in primate-like societies a lot of convergent features in terms of their brains and cognitive abilities. And so we happen to be working on spotted hyenas, and so here's what I wanted to tell you about today. I want to first introduce hyenas as a model for the study of the evolution of intelligence, tell you a little bit about the general methods that we use in studying them, tell you about some support that we have found for the social intelligence hypothesis, both in terms of the behavior of the animals and in terms of their brain features, and then at the end address some unresolved issues that we're working on right now. So these animals are really unusual. They live in very big, stable social groups called clans, and all the members of a clan know one another individually, and together they defend a common territory, and together they rear their cubs at a communal den. But their societies just don't look anything like the societies of any other gregarious carnivore that you can think of, including any of these. These animals tend to live in relatively small groups with relatively closely related individuals, at least within members of the same sex. And that's just not at all what happens in hyena societies, where you have animals who, of course, have kin groups within their larger groups, but they are also living with and competing with and cooperating with a lot of animals who are virtually entirely unrelated to them. So this is actually a lot more like what you see in the societies of baboons and other cercopithecine primates than what we see in carnivores, other carnivores. So we find that because the groups are comprised of a few kin and a lot of non-kin, that you get very low within-group mean relatedness. We have multiple overlapping generations in both hyenas and creatures like baboons. We have multiple adults of both sexes. We have matrilineal kin groups that form within the larger group. And most importantly, probably, the social organization is based on a hierarchical rank ordering. And these social characteristics are particularly interesting to me because carnivores and primates last shared a common ancestor somewhere between 90 and 100 million years ago. So if you want to test the social complexity hypothesis and remain within the mammals, this is about as independent a test as you can get. So we work on these creatures mainly in the Masai Mara National Reserve in southwest Kenya. We work on several different clans that all have territories adjacent to one another in this big open rolling grassland. We're right at the equator, 2 degrees south, and so we get a lot of sunshine, and that produces a lot of grass, and the grass supports a lot of herbivores, which in turn support loads of hyenas and other carnivores. So it's a great place to study them. The viz, as you can see, is very good. We know each individual in each of our 6 study clans by its unique patterns of spots and ear damage. And we spend several hours every day, mainly around dawn and dusk, sitting in vehicles like this one, to which the hyenas are very well habituated, and they just go about their business in front of us. And one of the things that we've recorded very religiously since the study began in 1988 is all interactions that look anything like this. This is a low-level fight you're seeing here between Cochise on the left and Oliver Twist. These are both adult females, but Cochise is exhibiting all the classic signs of hyena aggression. In defense of her cub, she's lunging up out of this hole. Her ears are cocked forward. Her eyes are wide open. By contrast, Oliver Twist has her ears plastered back. Her eyes are squinting closed to protect them. She gets close to Cochise. Her tail's down between her legs, and her whole body's crouched down and bent around towards Cochise in a very classic hyena appeasement posture. And it's because Oliver Twist is exhibiting appeasement in response to Cochise's aggression that in this particular little fight, we refer to Oliver Twist as the loser and Cochise as the winner. And this is very much like what primatologists do. But having recorded every single one of these that's occurred in our presence for the last 25 years, we actually have many tens of thousands of them in our database, and they allow us to generate a crystal clear picture of the social order during any given time period within our study. So here I'm showing you a simplified dominance hierarchy. I have taken out about 50 hyenas between Bailey and Midget here, but we've simply ranked them based on who wins and who loses in these fights. So the winners are listed over here, from the animal who can win against everybody else in the entire society down to Boston here, who can't win against anyone else. And the same animals are listed as losers across the top. And what the numbers in the matrix represent then are the number of fights that we've seen within each dyad where there was a clear winner and a clear loser. And so what you can see is that this is a very striking linear hierarchy. There are very few fight outcomes that are inconsistent with the rank orderings that we have assigned. And this is precisely what you'd find in a baboon troop or a macaque troop or a vervet troop, with the one interesting exception that is that these are all the adult females in the society, and these are all the adult breeding males. So you would find in a baboon troop all the males are dominating all the females, but that's not what happens in hyena society. So I need to tell you just a little bit about their life history. Female spotted hyenas give birth in an isolated natal den where they keep their cubs for about a month. They then pick them up and carry them to the clan's communal den. This is a typical communal den scene here. Cubs spend about 9 or 10 months at the communal den. They then start traveling around the home range, originally with their mothers and later on by themselves or with other clan mates. And females are philopatric. They spend their whole lives within the natal group, so eventually at some point after they're 2 years old and they become physiologically competent to breed, they start reproducing in the natal territory. By contrast, virtually 100% of males sometime after puberty, of their own volition, they pick up and move to another clan, and if they're lucky, they become socially integrated into a new group. But we have actually discovered over the years that the way hyenas acquire their ranks is exactly like what you find in Cercopithecine primates. So there's no genetic determination of rank. There is learning of rank, and it happens very early in life, and I think these animals come into the world prepared to learn this stuff. And the way that we know this is that when we first went out there, Laura Smale and I did a lot of what we euphemistically called bone tests, because that's what they were called back at Berkeley when you did them with beagles. But here what we did was actually to go find roadkill, things like gazelles in this case. And then we would wait until late afternoon when there weren't any grown-ups present at the den and only cubs are there. And then we would put this food object out, and the cubs are all very excited. They're racing out of the den hole here, coming over to fight and eat this food. So we're trying to simulate the competitive feeding conditions that you see amongst adults. And even though all these cubs are still nursing, they're very much interested in eating meat, and they fight very nicely over it. And so you can actually have wins and losses in this little test situation that usually lasts for about an hour before some adult will come back to the den and end the test. But then what you can do is actually rank these animals based on wins and losses, like I just showed you for the adult hierarchy, and look at that in relation to the ranks among their mothers. And you see rather dramatic change when we do these tests repeatedly on the same cohorts. We see phenomenally marked and rapid change. So here we've got them, their ranks based on wins and losses in these fights, plotted against their mother's ranks here, and you can see there's no relationship at all when they have first come to the den and they're just new at interacting with everybody in the society. But over the next few months, you can see that the relationship among the cubs comes to be isomorphic with the relationships among the mothers, and that all is completely finished by the time they are about between 12 and 18 months of age. And as we find in many primates, both individuals and entire matrilines within hyena society have ranks within the clan. So the alpha matriline tends to be the largest because they have priority of access to resources, and so you find all of them at the top of the dominance hierarchy, and then the members of the beta matriline all fall adjacent to one another, and then the third ranking matriline, and so on. So what we find is that even though hyenas and creatures like baboons compete over different resources, that the outcomes of their competitive interactions are determined by rank position in both taxonomic groups. So these are the lowest ranking individuals there who are not actually able to get in as readily as everyone else is to feed on that nice carcass. And an individual's rank position in hyena society, as in primate society, has a pretty profound effect on reproductive success, and it really doesn't make any difference what indicator of reproductive success you use in the species. Here I'm showing you age at first parturition in months on this axis against rank going from high to low. By convention, primatologists use 1 as the highest rank, the alpha female in this case. And you can actually see that here's the daughter of the alpha female. She starts breeding before she's 2.5 years old. She has her first litter. This is the daughter of the 19th ranked female, and she starts breeding when she's 72 months old. So she's actually 6 years old before she even starts to breed. So there's quite a large difference in the length of their reproductive lifespans, and in addition, for each year they're breeding, the high-ranking females tend to be more productive and produce more surviving offspring. And these various ways in which reproductive success is affected really has market effects on fitness over long periods of time. So just to show you what I'm talking about, I'm showing you 30 years worth of representation of adult females in one of our spotted hyena clans that somebody else had worked on before us, Lawrence Frank, starting in 1979. And when he went out there, he didn't know, he knew what their ranks were because he could observe their aggressive interactions, but he had no idea who was related to whom in those days. And so here they are in order of rank, and what we've got are at decade-long intervals, we've got the same, roughly the same number of adult females present in the clan, but you can actually see that the offspring or the descendants of K-Butt and N2 here actually now comprise together, we know now that those were sisters because we've subsequently done the genetic analysis, but now their descendants comprise, 30 years later, comprise 75% of the adult female representation in the entire clan. And you can actually see in those gray triangles what's going on is that entire matrilines are going extinct. So you really see that it really pays to have high rank in hyena society if you can manage it. And there are occasionally coups d'etat where one matriline will overthrow a higher ranking one and gain quite a big fitness advantage. So what we've seen here is that in a lot of respects, hyenas and cercopithecine primates have a lot in common. Their group size, the composition of the groups, the structure of the groups, their patterns of competition and cooperation, life history patterns and social development, and fitness consequences of rank. So we set out to ask in the late 1990s whether there are also similarities in social cognition between these taxa. And at this point, the primatologists had been worrying about this a fair amount. And so what we did was simply follow in the footsteps of the primatologists before us who had gone out and asked of their subject animals, can you do this feat of social cognition? Can you do this one? And without exception, so far, when we've gone out and asked our hyenas, can you do this too? Yes, they have been able to. So let me just show you a little bit about what I'm talking about. We know that hyenas can recognize one another using their noses, using their eyes, and using their ears. They can discriminate specific individuals. We know that, as in primates, they actually favor kin-based associations within the clan, and they direct their nepotistic behavior, helping behavior towards kin. We know that, as in baboons, they can recognize their paternal as well as maternal kin, even though the fathers have no role in child rearing in hyena society. And again, I just want to show you a couple of examples of the kinds of things I'm talking about. So we know about this being able to recognize individual voices, for example, by doing playback experiments, one of which you're seeing here. So there's the subject. In this particular case, we've got speakers hidden from her here, and videotape this trial. And in this case, what we were doing in this experiment was to actually play back distress vocalizations of infant hyenas to their mothers and other hyenas who were present in the environment. And you can see, I think, pretty directly, both in terms of the time they spend looking back at the speaker and also the percent of time after the playback where they actually are searching actively for this distressed cub. You can actually see that not only do the mothers respond to this, but so do their other kin, and animals who are unrelated to them don't waste any time looking for this distressed cub. So those are the kinds of lines of evidence that we have developed to understand who recognizes whom and by what sensory modalities. The fact is that, in contrast to baboons, hyenas are actually living in a fission-fusion society, and what that means is that mainly to avoid competition, because they're apex predators, of course. So in order to avoid competition, they often go off by themselves so that they can find something to eat and ingest it without having to hassle with everybody else. So you find hyenas sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups, sometimes in very big groups. And this is actually very handy for us because we can calculate how frequently they're found together in these observation sessions and actually assess the strength of their social relationships, which is what Amiel's doing with the whole data set in a very large and creative way. This is just dumb, simple stuff compared to what he's doing. But what we use is a twice-weight index of association, which is what's shown on this y-axis here. And all we're doing is we're listing up here all the observation sessions where hyenas A and B are found together and dividing that by the same number plus all the sessions where B is found without A and all the sessions where A is found without B. And that generates some fractional value here. And the point of this particular slide is just to show you that, as in monkeys, they prefer to hang out with their kin than non-kin. So they also, we now know that they can recognize that their potential social partners vary in their relative value to them, and they make choices according to that value. And I'm going to show you some data to support that assertion in just a second. We know that they can recognize third-party relationships based on both rank and kinship, just like monkeys can. And they further track a great deal of information about their social environments, and they actually use that information to make adaptive decisions. So again, just a couple of examples of the kind of thing I'm talking about here. Here's a situation where we're plotting, again, the same twice-weight association index here, and this time it's how frequently males, adult immigrant males, are found with adult females according to the female social rank list down here. And I should mention that males actually are the ones who initiate these social relationships, and the females that males initiate relationships with are often the ones that they end up mating with if they're spending time with her. So what you can see is we have no idea how they do this. We don't know what the mechanism is, but they can clearly recognize that these females are the ones to hang out with, ideally, and they prefer to hang out with these females over these females. And in fact, that's a good thing for them to do, because if you actually look at if they father cubs with those females, you can actually see what the average survivorship is going to be for the daughters of these low-ranking individuals. Going to be much shorter. Their lifespans are going to be much shorter than the offspring of these higher-ranking individuals up here. So somehow males figure out which females are the ones to hang out with and do that. We also know that as in primates, these animals form coalitions very frequently. So it's 2 or more hyenas ganging up on a third, and this is very useful to them for not only obtaining but also maintaining social rank, and they also use these coalitions to acquire and defend resources. That's what's going on here with this very big coalition. So one of the things that we've done is to ask about decision making. This is actually work my former student Jen Smith has done. Jen's actually coming to the networks workshop that's happening here soon. She's done some really nice work with networks as well. But this is something where she was asking, what are the variables that predict whether or not, if A and B here are in the middle of a fight, and you can see their body language is just what I showed you with Cochise and Oliver Twist earlier, right? This one's winning, this one's losing, and in the middle of this fight, along comes X. And so X has to make 2 decisions. First, do I join this fight at all? And second, who do I join if I do join it? And it's really quite extraordinary when, in Jen's modeling efforts, what was revealed here. I must say I was actually quite surprised. Not about the first 2 things, but the second 2 things. So they are much more likely to join, X is much more likely to join A if there's an indirect fitness benefit to be had. That is, if X is related to A. There are direct benefits insofar as X can reassert her dominance over B here, so that's a direct benefit. But ecology also matters. For example, if there's meat in the immediate environment, X is much less likely to help A than if there's no food in the environment. And they're even sensitive, as monkeys are, to audience effects. So X is much less likely to join A here if B has various adult relatives in the environment. So it's really been very surprising to me that these animals can actually even be aware of, much less take into consideration some of those surprising social variables. So in general sense, we're finding pretty striking similarities in social cognitive abilities between spotted hyenas and cercopithecine primates. So I would say so far the behavioral data strongly support the social intelligence hypothesis, but this led us to consider, well, has there been convergence in the brain? And the version of the social complexity hypothesis that is applied to nervous systems is referred to as the social brain hypothesis, and that actually predicts that we ought to see convergent evolution between hyenas and primates in terms of the neural tissue that's mediating social interactions in particular. And you can see this is a carnivore brain, this is a monkey brain. They're actually structured pretty differently, but you can actually find homologous landmarks and look histologically at what the tissue's doing and actually know something about where the equivalent of, say, frontal cortex is, and that's everything anterior to this cruciate sulcus, this big crevasse across the brain here. So we were in a quandary at the outset because, it's not immediately obvious whether one should worry about the whole brain, whether you should worry about regional brain volumes. I mean, if you look at these locusts, for example, this is desert locusts in the gregarious phase versus the solitary phase, and the whole nervous system is enlarged, as you can see. And then there's also very dramatic interspecific variation in even, say, within rodents in terms of particular brain areas that might be involved in remembering things like where you stored food. So we sort of adopted an intermediate approach to this here, focusing on the whole brain and most importantly, really, the area of the brain that is known in other mammals to be importantly involved in mediating social relationships, which is frontal cortex. So here's how we did this. We actually worked on virtual brains via endocast. This is my collaborator and neuroanatomist at MSU named Charlene Sakai. And what we did was to take a lot of different hyena skulls and actually put them in a CT scanner like that. And from the CT scans, you piece those back together, and you can actually generate a virtual brain, as I'll show you in just a second. This is the virtual brain inside the skull of a hyena. But our first mission was actually to think about this in a comparative sense, looking at the brains of spotted hyenas versus the other 3 extant hyena species. This is my sad little remnant hyena clade that exists on the surface of the earth today. It was once very speciose, but too bad for me. This is the only highly gregarious creature. This is a spotted hyena. That's the one I've been talking about. And then the 3 other species are much less gregarious. The Aardwolf is a diminutive little hyena that's a solitary all the time except when it's mating. And then striped and brown hyenas are, they always forage solitarily, but they might share a den with one or more close female relatives. So if if the social brain hypothesis is correct, what we ought to see is expansion of the front part of the brain in the following order, which I'm showing you here in 2 dimensions in various species of carnivores, 2 solitary ones and 2 gregarious ones. What we ultimately did in 3 dimensions with the endocast. But if the social brain hypothesis is correct, then we ought to see frontal cortex volume in particular decreasing as we move from spotted hyenas through the less gregarious ones to the real antisocial one, the Aardwolf, the solitary one. So here's an actual brain, here's a virtual brain. You can see that the same features are actually visible on the virtual brain as in the actual brain. And you can actually partition it. So we partitioned it into 4 divisions. These are the olfactory bulbs here at the very front of the brain. Then what we're calling anterior cerebrum, which is mainly frontal cortex. And then posterior cerebrum, which is cortex and a lot of subcortical structures. Then we have the brainstem and cerebellum back here. And we would correct the overall endocranial volume or brain volume for the size of the skull from which we drew that particular brain. Then we actually looked at the relationship between these various parts of the brain and the overall endocranial volume. So that's the correction factor here. So we have the olfactory bulbs again, anterior cerebrum, posterior cerebrum, and then the cerebellum brainstem area. And we can actually, Charlene did histological analysis to ascertain that histologically, we're actually, these divisions make sense. They're actually changes in the tissue as we move between these different areas. And so here are the main results, which are, here's the endocranial volume overall here as a function of group size, and this is Aardwolf, striped hyena, brown hyena, spotted hyena. So you can see that their brains are considerably larger. And then frontal cortex volume, again corrected for endocranial volume, is here's the Aardwolves, here they have striped, brown, and spotted hyenas. So this result in particular is sort of markedly convergent with the predictions of the social brain hypothesis. And just going backwards. So we're seeing that both the whole brain and frontal cortex are larger in spotted hyenas than less gregarious ones. So our data in the domain of the brain to date also support the social intelligence hypothesis. But there are some unresolved issues, and these are, to me, the currently most interesting ones. So there are a couple of things that the social intelligence hypothesis just can't explain, or at least hasn't been able to explain very well. And the first is grade shifts as we move between taxonomic groups in terms of relative brain size and relative cortex size. And the other is that it happens that the species that have highly developed social cognitive abilities also tend to excel in general cognition. And the social complexity hypothesis doesn't really predict either of those things. The primatologists have suggested that perhaps we see this kind of an effect if selection for larger brain size is associated with social complexity, then perhaps that larger brain, a greater amount of brain tissue can be co-opted for application to solving other types of problems. So here's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I refer to grade shifts. These are old data from Jerison, where he's just plotting the allometric relationships between brain size here and body size here, and these are all reptiles, and these are all mammals. And you can see that the slopes of those lines are very similar, but the mammals are all just shifted up quite a lot relative to the reptiles. And then more recently, Bush and Allman actually did a nice comparison looking at frontal gray matter in the cortex relative to the rest of neocortical gray for a number of different mammals. And I think what you can see strikingly here is that the slope of this relationship for primates is, the slope of that line is a lot steeper than we find for carnivores. And these are the kinds of things that the social complexity hypothesis alone has a hard time explaining. And so I'm just showing you with an anecdote here, the kind of thing that is so mysterious, really, from my point of view. So we see that despite these animals have remarkably similar social problem-solving abilities. So hyenas and, say, baboons do, and their societies are astonishingly similar, if you ask me. Yet, if you had to think about general intelligence, domain general, non-specific intelligence, away from just strictly dealing with the social world, baboons appear to exhibit a lot greater behavioral complexity than, or behavioral flexibility, I should say, than hyenas. And just, again, in an anecdotal way, we think of behavioral plasticity as a hallmark of intelligence, and if it was being generated by social complexity per se, then these animals ought to behave similarly. But you can see this is a tour vehicle in South Africa, and these baboons have not only discovered how to get into that rooftop carrier, but they've actually gone crazy investigating it and tearing it all apart and so forth. And by contrast, my students and I sleep every single night in little canvas boxes like this one, and we sleep with the doors open. There's just a little piece of screen between you and this, and we know that there's hyenas and lions walking around out here every night because you can see their tracks in the morning when you get up, and they can look in there and they can see us and they can smell us and hear us, but we know with complete confidence that they are not going to come and eat us, so we just sleep very well there. And I think the reason is that they just don't, they can't think outside the box in the same way that those monkeys can. So, I mean, if you left a banana or a granola bar on your bed in here and a baboon walked by during the day, they would just burst into the tent and take it. And God knows the hyenas certainly have the equipment to open your tent if they want to, but they don't. So, this sort of leads you to this overwhelming, to me, question of how general intelligence has come into being. And so we started a couple of years ago messing around with this by asking the hyenas how well they do at solving non-social problems, and we started with this very simple paradigm where we're actually looking at, we used a design test apparatus robustly built for hyenas out of rebar, weighs about 70 pounds, but it's designed after Edward Thorndike's original puzzle box apparatus that he invented for his dissertation in 1911. And in his case, the animals had to figure out how to get out of this box, and in this case, the hyena has to figure out how to get into this box to get this piece of meat. We just put this down in the environment, and the hyenas will encounter it. And all the animal has to do to open the box is slide this bolt from right to left, and the door swings open. So they can do that with their mouths, as this guy's doing here, or they can do it with their paws, or whatever. They can use a lot of different techniques to get in there. So we were looking at a couple of things. We were interested to know about their associative learning, their change in behavior over successive trials, to see how rapidly they were able to change their behavior based on success or failure opening the box. And then we went back and actually looked at where animals that had multiple trials. We asked, okay, does the behavior of the animal in its first interaction with the box predict whether or not it's going to ultimately be able to open this box? And there were three things in particular that, based on hypotheses put forward in the literature, that we were interested to pursue. The first was innovation. How many different behaviors does the animal try when it actually is interacting with the box? How persistent is it? How much does it work at trying to get into the box? And how fearful is the animal of the box? So with respect to associative learning, here's Thorndike's box again. Here's Thorndike, a typical learning curve for one of the cats that he had in the box trying to get out. And here's Gucci, one of our star hyena box openers, in repeated trials, and you can see that she's figuring this out and getting faster and faster, just as the cat in Thorndike's box. So they're using trial and error learning to figure this out. We actually ultimately conducted 354 trials on 58 different individuals in 3 study clans, and extracted the data later from videotaped trials. And in fact, video innovation and persistence and neophilia all actually predicted whether or not an animal would ultimately be successful at opening the box. So here's what we were loosely calling innovation. So this is the number of different behaviors you try when you first encounter the box, and the animals that are successful here are in the dark bars, and the animals that never manage to open the box that are in the white bars. So it pays to try a lot of different stuff. It also pays to persist in your efforts, at least for a while. The animals that were more persistent and worked harder at this for longer were likelier to succeed than the animals who didn't. And you can't be too fearful. Obviously, if you're too afraid to interact with the box, you're not ever going to be able to open it. So what we've been doing more recently is doing comparative testing in these gregarious versus solitary hyenas, striped versus spotteds, and this is just the most preliminary data, but because we've only tested 3 striped hyenas so far, but this is just mean exploration diversity again, the innovation measure that we're using, and the spotted hyenas, these are all in captivity, by the way. These are all trying a lot more behaviors than the striped hyenas, even though the tools that these 2 species have to work with to deal with this box are identical. Okay, so what we've seen so far is that there are we've seen a lot of support for the social brain hypothesis, both in terms of behavior and brains. It does appear that social complexity may shape the evolution of social cognitive abilities, and it might also potentially contribute to the evolution of more domain general intelligence. But what about these grade shifts? And so that's what I just want to turn my attention to for a few minutes here. And this is work mainly done by a former student in my lab. He's now a postdoc at Minnesota, named Eli Swanson, who very, very good at modeling, and we're building here on earlier work done by all these people. So there's a big literature on brain size and brain volumes in carnivores. And here, I'm sorry about the slide, I just want to walk you through it so that we're all on the same page. Because what Eli did was he ran these phylogenetically corrected generalized least square models to account not only for shared history, but also a number of different variables that we could draw from the literature about a whole slew of carnivore species, not just hyenids anymore, but many different species. So we're looking at social variables, ecological, morphological, and life history variables as potential predictors of brain size. And some of the predictors were composite measures, for example, using PC1 from a principal components analysis. For example, the social complexity principal component PC1 was including all of these different variables and then some. And then he actually used a maximum likelihood size-based ancestral reconstruction to find out how change in body size over evolutionary time has affected brain size, and used 4 different measures for assessing the strength of the phylogenetic signal for each of the dependent measures that we were using, which were all those different brain regions that I showed you earlier. And then he actually calculated endocranial volume as residuals from phylogenetically corrected regressions against 2 different correction factors. This is the one that most people use. They actually go to literature and find some average body mass for a particular species and use that to correct for brain size. But in this case, because we're using these virtual brains, we actually had the skulls from which each specimen came. So you'll see some pretty striking differences in these 2 correction factors. And then finally, we're looking at the volume of each brain region and correcting that for the overall endocranial volume. And so here are the species that we are working with. These are all mammalian carnivores, 36 species of them. We have multiple specimens in each species, and we're looking at overall endocranial volume plus measures of all these individual brain areas from the CT scans, plus all of these other variables, measures of social complexity, ecological complexity, foraging demands, life history data, whether the animal uses its 4 paws in manipulating food, for example, all kinds of questions that we could address here. And what you can see in the results is that phylogeny clearly matters. There are big differences between these families of carnivores. So this is the weasel family up here, several different species in the weasel family. Then this is the raccoon family. This is the bear family. This is the dog family, cat family, hyena family, and mongoose family. And the white correction factor is corrected for mass based on the literature, and the gray is corrected for overall skull size. So we're seeing pretty striking variation here, and interestingly, some of the biggest brains are in the solitary creatures. The mustelids and the ursids are very rarely found in groups larger than 1. But when he actually ran these models and asked about the overall brain size over here on the right and these various brain areas, this is the cerebellum and brainstem area, the anterior cerebrum and the posterior cerebrum. Sociality has a positive effect on overall cerebrum size, but not, interestingly, on the anterior cerebrum, which is what we saw within the family Hyenidae when we analyzed that alone. And you see that home range size has a negative effect on anterior cerebrum volume. Diet, I'll show you that in a minute, has some interesting effects, especially negative on overall brain size, the way this is configured. Forelimb use and life history variables didn't have any kind of impact on in these models, but body size change from the previous ancestor had an effect. So here, for example, is the effect of diet, where we're looking at relative brain volume in these are all mammalian carnivores, but some, like hyenas and lions, eat meat. Some eat everything like bears and dogs, and others will eat strictly insects. And it doesn't matter what correction factor you use here, apparently you don't need a big brain to eat insects. And carnivores have the biggest brains here, and omnivores are intermediate. And then asking about the strength of the phylogenetic signal in these models is interesting. You get a strong overall signal for overall brain size no matter what measure you use, but none for overall cerebrum size, which suggests that perhaps this is relatively plastic and might be under selection, at least in mammalian carnivores. But the most recent thing that we've done is actually to do this in even a larger comparative context, which is this is the same results I just showed you for the mammalian carnivore families for which we have our own data, and then there was another data set of endocranial volumes for all these different monkeys, and these are various 17 Cercopithecine species, 4 hominid species. Each of these numbers in parentheses here is the number of species that we're talking about. And I think, you know, what the branch lengths here aren't meaningful particularly, but everything else is corrected for so that they can be compared directly. And I think you can see right off the bat that the range of variation in these primate brains is enormously larger than what we see in the carnivore brains. And of course, as you know, variability in traits like this is the stuff on which natural selection works. So it actually suggests that the very evolvability of brains might be different than in monkeys from what it is in carnivores. And just again, this is more by way of anecdote, but I'm just thinking, okay, well, what might actually constrain behavioral flexibility in carnivores relative to things like monkeys? And if we just think about phylogeny by itself, which is, you know, certainly we're seeing effects of phylogeny here. There are a couple of things. For example, skull morphology. You know, carnivores have these great, big, robust cheekbones, and your cheekbones look just like this. They're puny. And the skull of this guy has great, huge ridges of bone everywhere for attachment of jaw closing muscles. And, you know, your skull looks more like this skull's, which is very rounded, and you really don't have much muscle at all on the top of your heads. And, you know, they need that, though, because the carnivores need it, because once you actually have a prey animal down, you need to be able to process it, and that is not a trivial thing. So every meat-eating carnivore actually has in its mouth a very effective toolkit that involves crushing tools, slicing tools, you know, tearing tools, and they are very handily able to kill things even way bigger than they are themselves. And so, you know, you just don't have the need for these structures in a monkey that you need in a carnivore. So you need these big muscle attachment sites for attachment of the main jaw closing muscles, which are, of course, the temporalis and the masseter. And then carnivores need to be able to run down fast-moving prey in many cases, and so they have limb structure adapted for that. And so this is a typical carnivore foot, and they have been favored by selection not to walk on the flat of their feet or hands, but instead it's what is referred to as a digitigrade stance, where you actually are walking up on the tips of your toes, and that's what you're seeing on those pads. Those are the very tips of 4 of the toes. And by contrast, monkeys have this wonderful plantigrade. You know, they can put their hands around things to grab branches and so forth. That is going to, I think, totally change the way the animal interacts with the world, and it's going to give this animal a lot more opportunities to interact with its environment, if you will, than that animal is going to have by virtue of not having a limb structure like this. And it's you know, certainly come to my attention that a lot of people working with robots and thinking about embodied intelligence argue very forcefully that the nature of your interactions with the world, the fineness of the detail with which you can interact, is going to have a big effect on the embodied intelligence that you know, you are capable of, and your learning capabilities if you're interested in machine learning, that sort of thing. So it seems to me that this might be having you know, account for big differences in these animals as well, because once you've got hands, then you can use them for all kinds of interesting things. And here, for example, you can actually use your hands to pick parasites off your colleague, and this can come to have fantastically important significance in the bonds that occur between individuals in primate society. This is about as elaborate as grooming gets in any carnivore. There's a mother giving her cub a bath, and that's pretty much it. When you've got hands too, you can actually travel with your parents and constantly be learning from your social environment, whereas carnivores all get parked at dens and left there, so that you have radically different opportunities for social learning made possible by those hands. So anyway, I think that it's at least possible, and I'm going to leave you with just the idea of this as an hypothesis, that limb and skull morphology might constrain the evolution of intelligence, which might contribute, in fact, to the existence of these grade shifts that I've shown you and brain size patterns like that one. Thanks very much.